Greetings, Collapsniks, and welcome to another edition of the Collapse Cafe here on the Doomstead Diner. Okay, folks, this week I am going to move a little bit off of the topic of economics, which is usually my favorite aspect of collapse observation, and into the world of politics. Um, and specifically, this time around, we're going to talk about what's going on in the Middle East, which has been a hotbed of violence and warfare, conflict, since time immemorial, going all the way back to biblical times and even before biblical times. Um, it's where the recorded wars of history began. And in those good old days, God used to drop in all the time and help one group or another smite their enemies and do all sorts of wonderful things. But God does not drop in these days to the wars, at least not directly. And although many people claim to be operating in His name, the only way you can tell whose side God was on is by who won at the end, because that's the side that God must have been on, right? God would not be a loser. um, and So you had all sorts of stuff go on: the Assyrians, the Babylonians, uh, the Persians, and the warfare. Crossed the border into Europe between the Persians and the Greeks, the Athenians and the Spartans. I don't know, you might have seen the movie The 300. Uh, Alexander the Great took over the area for a while. I think Genghis Khan also ran his empire all the way down there as well. So conquerors throughout history have been moving in and out of the place. Um, and things have not changed in the industrial era. The beginnings of what we see now, though, can be traced back to the old Ottoman Empire, which was controlled by Turkey, the Turkish Ottomans. They they held the empire in the 1800s during the colonial period for Western Europe, and around the turn of the century, uh, the British, the French, well, everybody began to covet that area of the world because geologists had discovered that there was plenty of oil under the ground, under those desert sands. They knew that by then, and the industrial economy was beginning to transition from coal to oil because, of course, the internal combustion engine had been invented. Automobiles were in the mix, and the airplane also had been invented by the early 1900s. So uh, when World War One broke out, the Germans were allied with the Ottoman Turks as the Axis powers, and the Germans and French were the Allied powers fighting that war. And so the as part of the war, not only did they fight along the in the fields of France with the trench warfare and all the rest of that, in a very bloody conflict, the first industrial war, really. Well, you might call the Civil War, an industrial war as well to an extent. But you didn't have automobiles and airplanes and so forth. Those those were first used in World War One. So uh, we are most familiar with the warfare that went on up there, and that's where America dropped in late in the war and helped out the Allied powers and more or less turned the tide there, uh, and leading to the eventual defeat of Germany. But down in the Middle East, the Brits and the French were fighting. You had the French Foreign Legion, of course, very famous, and the British as well had a very large interest. And one man became very famous, a fellow by the name of T.E. Lawrence, known as Lawrence of Arabia, who was a lieutenant in the British Expeditionary Force. And he was a kind of Arabophile or desert lover, and was fascinated by that whole life down there. And he eventually became attached to the Arab uh, political division in Britain, and was assigned the task of uh, getting the Arabs, which they did not really think of themselves as Arabs. They were just a whole bunch of different tribes uh, of people that lived in some of the least productive and worst land available in the world where there was any population at all. Um, the Bedouin, of course, were pretty much the only people living on the desert sands of the Sahara, Saudi Arabia. The population of a very large area was very tiny. And then you had some other tribes occupying what's present day Syria and Jordan. And then you've got on the other side of uh, the Suez Canal, Egypt and Algeria and Morocco, where France was more powerful. The Lawrence's job, was to get the Arabs to revolt against the Ottoman Empire in a war for freedom, become freedom fighters, if you will, uh, with the idea that they would become independent and be able to rule themselves instead of being ruled by the Ottomans, which of course appeals to anybody uh, who wants to be free, right? But why do people want to be free? Mainly because they don't want to be taxed. Okay, um, and so uh, Lawrence was able to cobble together an army uh, of these different tribes, which all really did not like each other. They were just a bunch of warring factions and had a long historical animosity towards one another. But for the purposes of the war, the enemy of my friend or the friend of my enemy is my enemy or something like that. Anyway, the Ottomans was all their enemy, and so they all were willing to fight together to get rid of them. Uh, and through the course of the war, as it went, in fact, the British and French alliance with America and then with this ragtag army of desert rats uh, did win the war, and as a result, supposedly the Arabs were given their freedom, but that wasn't really true. You see, it was the end of the colonial era, uh, and Britain still uh, maintained colonies and so forth. I don't think India had its independence yet at that time. They were still part of the British Empire. Um, and so there was still quite a bit of commerce and whatnot that went between India and and Britain, as resources were extracted from India and brought to the little island of Britain, helping them to become quite rich uh, as a tiny, tiny nation, which is how they managed to do it. They were a naval power throughout the colonial period, starting in the very early 1700s. And of course, America started out as a British colony, and they had Australia as well, um, Canada. Uh, well, the French had part of Canada, and the Brits had the rest. But at any rate, uh, so when the at the conclusion of the war, uh, Lawrence did manage to liberate Damascus, which was the center of the Arab world, the sort of the capital of the Ottoman Empire in that neighborhood. Although Constantinople was the real capital of the Ottoman Empire itself, um, and at the beginning, upon liberating it, uh, with the idea of it being a democracy, something called the Arab Council was formed, and they were going to supposedly take over politically and run it. But at the same time, in secret, the British and the French, a couple of British and French civil servants, Sykes and Picot, uh, wrote out a treaty where they divided up the whole area into spheres of influence, with the British uh, having a greater influence in one part and the French in another. Uh, and so this is the old idea of divide and conquer. They have already broken off the area from the Ottomans, and now they have divided it further between themselves. And then on top of that, the idea of keeping that whole neighborhood together as one country was a completely uh, infeasible option due to the fact that there were many, many differences between these different groups of people, different tribes. Uh, Islam is broken up into two major factions, Sunnis and Shiites. And so what they did was they drew a bunch of boundaries, uh, which are to a large extent artificial boundaries, defining area of Jordan and Syria, Saudi Arabia. You had Iran down in the southern end of the Aden Peninsula, uh, and then over to the east you had Iran and Iraq. Uh, and each of these areas got their own either royal family in charge or military leaders. You had Nasser in Egypt, the Shah of Iran, and then Jordan had its own king. And of course, we all know the House of Saud, which is the royal family of Saudi Arabia, who in the years since became fabulously wealthy. And they had been among the poorest people in the world. They're one of the Bedou tribes. Uh, and another couple of countries formed, or areas, colonies, uh, was Palestine, and Palestine was administered by the Brits, as well as Aden, which is down on the Gulf of Aden by the Arabian Sea. And Aden later, once they did become independent from the Brits, became Yemen. And these areas that were being run by the Brits directly as their governments uh, attracted the populations that lived there were all of the Arab tribes that nobody else wanted. Either the Saudis didn't want them, or Jordan didn't want them, or Iran didn't want them, or Iraq. And so you had this hodgepodge of different groups down there, uh, and Brits running the show. And they had the property in Palestine under their control until 1948, when their UN mandate ran out. Uh, and what happened in 1948, at the end of World War II, not World War One now, we're 20, 30 years later, at the end of World War II, was there were a large number of Jews who had been displaced in one way or another in Europe as a result of uh, Germany's policy of eradicating genocide for the Jewish population up there. So these folks wanted their own place to be safe and where they wouldn't be persecuted as they had been historically in almost every place they went. And they were driven out of Russia in the pogroms. Russia or Germany, of course, had the final solution. They were driven out of Egypt by the Pharaoh, going way back in history, and so forth. And then through the Christian era, they were sort of persona non grata, except for the fact that they ran the banking industry even back then. And of course, you have the famous story of Jesus flipping over the banca, which are the desks that money lenders use in those days, and had that, and because the in the Christian view of things, the charging of interest was illegal, and so the Christians couldn't themselves handle banking in those years, so it was turned over to the Jews. Uh, so they wanted a homeland, and the solution that the Brits came up with for themselves was to establish the homeland of the Jews in Palestine and called it the State of Israel. And thus Israel was formed in 1948, and now a whole nother group of people, besides the Palestinians, who are, again, just a bunch of different tribes of people. They're not one people. Um, and the Jews now running the show in place of the departing Brits. And the difference between the Jews who were coming down from Europe and the Palestinian population is that many of those Jews were very well educated people who were familiar with the early workings of industrialism, engineers, scientists, bankers, of course. And when Damascus was liberated, it was an almost immediate humanitarian disaster. The hospitals had no water, there were no lights, and it had no water because, of course, the electricity wasn't working, which didn't run the water pumps, and so in a city of that size, you don't work with, little wells dug in the ground with a bag like the Bedouin used out in the Saudi desert. Uh, you actually pipe the water and into the buildings and so forth. So you have a waterworks. Well, none of that stuff worked, and the only way to get it to work was to bring back the Brits um, to run those things. So as soon as they started to need the West and the industrialized civilization to run those things, take care of those things, they once again were economically uh, at the mercy of the West. And the Israelis, of course, the Jewish population was able to take over all that stuff because they had the education and so forth to be able to handle all of those things. And so you ended up with this population there of the Jews who had access to all of the economic benefits of the area, the trade that went through there, and the oil that was being moved through the area, through the Suez Canal. And so the other side of that was the Palestinian population, who were mostly poor, uneducated people, and of course, culturally different and at odds with the Jewish population that was in charge. And so over the years, that difference between haves and have nots uh, has become greater and greater. The Israelis became quite rich in the as a nation, and the Palestinians are wedged over on the other side in Gaza. The Israelis have the good ports in Tel Aviv and the city of Jerusalem. So, of course, these folks have never had their own government, the Palestinians. They have always been at the behest of the Israelis, who basically don't like them. They don't like the Israelis. And when you have this disparity of money and cultural differences and so forth, it has led to a constant state of war between all the people that live inside that little area of what used to be Palestine, which was actually never a country itself until it had been created as a protectorate for the British after World War I. So all artificial, all a result of colonialism. And a similar thing happened down in Aden, which was actually the last outpost of the British Empire. It was given back to the Yemenis in 1962. And the Brits had kept that area because even though it didn't have much oil, it was very important to them in the early years because the British Navy, which was their power source, was itself powered by coal. It was after the sail era, but before the oil era. And they needed coal refueling stations for their ships that were going between England and going through the Mediterranean, where they would get coal in Israel, go through the Suez Canal, then more coal down on depots down in Aden, and then on from there to India and even to Australia. So they had all these little waypoints for coal restocking of the ships. And but by 1962, they no longer needed that, and so they left the neighborhood. And in that case, the economic driver for the area over that period had been the British commerce going back and forth through there. But once they abandoned it, well, it was like all the abandoned towns on the old streets uh, of the Lincoln Highway before the interstate was built in the United States. They all turned into ghost towns, you know. Well, that's what happened there too. They didn't have any oil, and they no longer had the British ships and trade going back and forth through this. So it became an economic basket case, and they are culturally different from the Saudis. They are more like the Iranians, Sunni Muslims. I always get confused which ones are the Shiites and which are the Sunnis, but I'm pretty sure I'm right there. Um, and so they can't integrate with Saudi Arabia. They and be get part of that the money that is flowing out of oil wells that are really just on the other side of the border. Um, and But they still are right on the water and right on the Gulf of Aden, which leads into the Red Sea, which leads to the Suez Canal. Uh, and it's a great place to be uh, shooting missiles from at the shipping that goes back and forth through there. So that's their form of terrorism and their form of warfare. You've got the Palestinians who are using their form of terrorism, bombing various hospitals and schools and whatever, uh, temples in Israel to protest their uh, uh, situation, and the Yemenis, or Houthis, I believe is the tribe, uh, protesting their impoverishment by disrupting the shipping. So this is this economic cause and this history of colonialism that dates back well over 100 years, 150 years, uh, is the root cause of the problems that stem that we have now in the Middle East. And that, of course, all comes from the desire of the industrialized nations to extract the resources from the area, which is oil. That's about the only thing that they have down there. They don't have other minerals and so forth, uh, although those are available further to the east in the mountains of Afghanistan and places like that. And so, as a through point, that does become important. Um, so, what I'm trying to bring across with all of this is that while a lot of people think and feel that the warfare down there is all over religion, Jews versus Arabs, or Jews versus Muslims, and Sunnis versus Shiites, and so forth. At the root of it all is really economics and the way in which the political boundaries of the region were set up. Um, Going way back when, and the fact that there's so much inequity, and you have in each area you have a group of haves and a group of have-nots, and as we spin down and collapse here, the have-nots are becoming. It's not just being poor; their very existence is threatened. It's an existential crisis for these people. Uh, and, when you get to that point, that's when you strike out. It's frustration and you have no other outlet. And really, the only solution is a more equitable distribution of the remaining wealth in the area, but you will never see haves willingly being giving up their wealth to the have-nots, and so it's become a very insoluble problem. And what you see is an upward spiraling violence because you have greater and greater numbers of have-nots being created as the overall amount of resources and the overall amount of wealth, the whole pie is shrinking. Uh, so it's not a very good looking future. And if you want to look back here in the United States, you really kind of have the same thing going on uh, with the folks in South America and Central America who have all turned into refugees migrating northward. The violence and so forth has been kept away from the United States, from America proper, for, well, right to this day, and happens down in those Central American and uh, South American countries. But as that population is starting to migrate here and coming across the border, and we are piling these people into refugee camps and homeless encampments in our sanctuary cities, places like New York, Boston, Los Angeles. Uh, those places and those congregations of people who left their countries because they were economically shut out are becoming our own little Palestines. And there are our own Palestinians in those areas. And if we're not careful and a more equitable solution to those migrants is not found, then we're going to have exactly the same thing going on here as you have going on between the Israelis and the Palestinians over across the pond. So that's something to think about, I think, for people as we move forward here in collapse here in the fascist states of America. What do you want for your future? And, are you willing to share and give up part of the wealth to all of these people who are coming in here? Or are you just going to try and shut them out and keep them shut out? And if that's what happens, well, the only outcome from that is warfare, and that's just another manifestation of collapse. So on that bright note, I'm going to leave you for today, and not sure what I'll talk about next time, but I hope you're all doing well. Come visit us at chasingthesquirrel.com and, of course, the YouTube channel and Doomstead Diner, still under the Doomstead Diner name. Just put that into the YouTube search box and you can go back through all the old videos. And come join us on our forum, which you'll find as a subweb of the chasingthesquirrel.com website as well. And we'd love to talk to you. And if anybody would like to talk to me directly, feel free to drop me a note, a message over on our message board, and we can chat online if you want, or just privately in emails, whatever. I'm always interested to hear other people's ideas on what's going on. And that's all doom. This time until next time, here on the Collapse Cafe of the Doomstead Diner. Hasta la